Welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms, joined by my buddy and personal professor, Bob Forrant.
Good afternoon.
Yes, and our special guest today, Park Ranger Resi Polixa, joining us again from our last episode. This is now going to be part 2. Welcome, Resi, again. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So
this might be the first time we've done a two-parter.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely, because there's so much rich history. The last time we were talking about, I think one of the things that stood out the most in my mind was Manny Diaz and drag in Lowell. And I think Benita and Chiquita were definitely things that I was thinking about, but also, of course, the blackface that was happening, because that's a little, that's problematic. But we definitely were even further back than that. And we were talking about some mill girls, something I didn't expect that we were going to talk about. So I think this is why we had to do this again, because it's so rich. We have to keep digging in deep, and that's what we do on this show. We just dig deeper into these same spaces, but what is going on?
I mean, the thing I would say is that when we think about LGBTQ plus history, again, is like being really mindful of the labels we're ascribing to different eras, right? So, when we talk about the Mill Girls era, right, the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender were not in their use. Like the Mill Girls weren't using that language. So we kind of have to take off our 20th century history caps and like put on different lenses or something to analyze that era, because it's just sort of a whole different ballgame. There's a different language essentially to learn. So, and I think that's true if you go back to even further eras, right? I would love to learn more about kind of indigenous Lowell pre-colonization. And, I think today within the LGBTQ plus community, there's an identity known as Two-Spirit, which happens to be an identity for indigenous people who have same gender attraction or different gender expression than what they might be ascribed at birth, right? But that label, Two-Spirit, was kind of adopted really in the 70s in widespread use, right? So if we go back to indigenous Lowell, like way, way back, into the 1700s or 1600s, that language doesn't exist either, but I would like to learn more about kind of the gender norms of the indigenous people who are here.
It seems to take a while, but then these disciplines begin to sort of make their way, right? I mean, when I was in college, I sat in buildings for African American studies because nobody taught Black history, as it was, as it would have been called back then. And the thought that we had to demand that some segment of the history had to, we had to like fight to have it have space. Is it similar in terms of what you're working on and from your own college experience and whatnot, that there's a burgeoning here of the sort of work that you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. So when I was in college, we didn't have an LGBTQ plus history class. I took a lot of women's history classes, and I know neighboring colleges did offer LGBTQ plus history, but
this is at Mount Holyoke, right?
Yeah, so at Mount Holyoke, like the whole Pioneer Valley is kind of a consortium. So I could take classes at UMass Amherst, I could take classes at Amherst College, Hampshire College, Smith College, out of those 5 schools, and of course UMass has so much to offer. Only one school had an LGBTQ plus history class, and that was at Smith.
So of all those colleges and universities in the 5 college area, one course. So yeah, I mean, it is similar in a way to when people started pushing harder for African American studies or Latinx studies or women's history.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because, there's the aspect of studying the history part of it, but then, I think there's a whole batch of academics kind of like this intersects with gender studies in a way. So you get like gender theory, you get a lot of queer theory that happens. But, I think when we're talking about history, it's still kind of like starting from scratch in some ways, so we have like dominant frameworks to think about like LGBTQ plus history in big urban centers like New York or San Francisco, right? There's a lot of studies about those places. But when we get into kind of the smaller cities, right? Like Lowell, for instance, there's not very much here. There's a little bit of work done by Mehmed Ali and Beth Brassel, I think, in the early 2000s, who did some oral history work. But beyond that, I think it's still a lot of it is going from scratch here.
You have to really be a detective because of that lack of information, you have to figure out what are you even trying to look for. Right. And the way that language evolves over time, it's like, I think you mentioned invert as a word that we definitely wouldn't use now, but that was the language that they used in that time. So that's, I applaud you for doing this work, because this is how now we can bring it up and bring it to the people. And that's why we do this.
In our national park world, we often talk about programs that are like citizen science. You engage the visitors in doing scientific method work, right? I feel like there's a real potential to talk about like citizen history in a way. Like history is a process. It's not a finished sentence, right? So as I tell you these stories, there's still more work that needs to be done, and whether I can undertake it all or someone else needs to take it on, or hopefully a lot of people will take it on, but it definitely is a process. It's a process of remembering and collecting and getting to know the people who live these stories and learn from them. So there's a lot to do, a lot to learn.
Absolutely. I think that we left off in the 1950s bar era, pre-Stonewall, right? And we were talking about how I think immigrant history also intersects with the LGBTQ plus history in Lowell. And I think it's really interesting that we kind of left off in the acre, right? The bars in the acre. Yeah. And that's also historically where immigrant groups first come, and that's where they settle. So I think that intersection is really interesting. Can we start there and dig into that?
Yeah. So kind of touching on, like I mentioned, Mehmed Ali and Beth Brassel. So on the Center for Lowell History website and in their actual building, they have oral history collections there of different individuals. And I think one of the people they interviewed for oral history is like donated a lot of their photos and also materials, which is really cool. And so that one person that I'm thinking of, her name is Lynn Berry. And so Lynn Berry was originally from Worcester, but moved to Lowell because I think what happened was her parents kind of kicked her out, from having come out in a way. Her parents were like, no more. So she left Worcester, she came to Lowell. Her oral histories are really fascinating. She talks about working at a gas station. I think if I'm locating it correctly, would be by the Bishop Markham apartments on Gorham Street. So like kind of right across that whole area, there used to be at least a gas station where she would work. She talked about looking out for other people like her and hiring them. So essentially she had this all woman run gas station that was basically all run by lesbian women in the 1950s.
That's amazing.
I know, it's pretty cool. And I have a bunch of books, which unfortunately I think are out of print right now. But I found this book particular at a used bookstore. So this is called The Persistent Desire, a Femme Butch Reader. So this was collected by Joe Nessel. I talk about how like New York is such a locus of LGBTQ plus history. So Joe Nessel founded a really cool organization called the Lesbian Her Story Archives. And it's founded, I think she founded it in her house actually in Brooklyn. And then the archive got too big, so she had to find another house to move into. So this is an anthology she put together. In the 70s and 80s, like there was this real push, I think, in New York to get all these stories together. And that's where the Her Story Archives comes from. That's where this book comes from. But the stories, well, Joan is from New York. The stories are from all over. There's like international letters that people have contributed. There's stories from across the United States. And there's a photo of Lynn Berry here, which is pretty cool. So, you know, the fact that Lowell has some representation in this like really seminal text from the 70s and 80s is pretty cool. And so Lynn Berry, while she was living in Lowell, frequented a bar that's called Moody Gardens, and that is what Beth Brassel and Ahmed Ali looked into, was this establishment called Moody Gardens. It was on Moody Street, of course. I think Moody Gardens is a fabulous name. I love it. And it started as a business in, let's see my notes here. I have it, 1933, it started as a business, but it wasn't until 1957 that it really became a hangout spot for a lot of lesbian women at the time. So between 1957 and then it closed in 1964. The story goes that Moody Gardens was across the street from another bar called the Silver Star, and Moody Gardens wasn't doing too well financially in the 50s. And Silver Star across the street had hired this all-woman country western band to perform one night. And it drew such a big crowd to Silver Star, but Silver Star wasn't too happy that these patrons were all, you know, females of dubious activity kind of thing. But Moody Gardens was like, you know, really hurting for money. So they decided, okay, you know, whatever, there's a big crowd over there. They could just come over here and we could make some more income from them. So after that night, Moody Gardens hired the same Western band to perform there regularly. And that's how it became the hangout spot that it did. And Lynn Berry really loved going there. She talks about how there was kind of a community of other women who lived, you know, not too far from Moody Gardens, maybe just down the street. Moody Gardens was owned by the Berube family, so French-Canadian family, so kind of in the Little Canada area. And so that was the kind of the main hangout spot for a good 7 years about. And then it closed. You know, there were other folks in the acre were not too happy about this kind of business that was going on. So, you know, there were complaints lodged against Moody Gardens by like St. Patrick's, other kind of religious entities really not happy about, you know, at this time, at this era, 50s and 60s, people are using the word homosexual. So they're not really happy about homosexual women being there. This is another book that I have. I brought this up last time. Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. This is kind of the big text of lesbian history. And when Lillian Faderman is talking about kind of the pre-Stonewall bars, there's actually a quote in here. I was stunned when I found it. I wasn't expecting it. To us, it was our world, a small world, yes, but if you are starving, you don't refuse a slice of bread, and we were starving. Just for the feeling of having others around us. We were the kings of the hill, we were Moody Gardens. And I was really surprised to see Lowell, Massachusetts included in this book as well. And you know, this is a very common phenomenon, especially in kind of working class cities across, you know, the Northeast and maybe larger United States, that bars would be the place for lesbian women to hang out between the 50s, 60s era. There's studies about, I think Buffalo, New York has a study called Slippers of Gold, I think, and Boots of Leather, which is about something similar. There's when was this published? Maybe early 90s, there's a fiction semi-autobiographical really, called Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. And Leslie Feinberg grew up in upstate New York, working class, kind of identified as a butch woman while they were growing up. And they talk a lot about kind of this bar era, this bar phenomenon, semi-autobiographical of Leslie's life. So this is definitely a well-documented phenomenon for LGBTQ plus history. So it's not surprising at all that it was present here in Lowell too. Moody Gardens really stands out because it was kind of the one bar for lesbian women, but there were plenty of other bars for gay men around the area too. And it doesn't have the same sort of legwork that Moody Gardens has with Beth Russell and Mehmet Ali studying it. So this is sort of getting more into starting from scratch territory. But one of the other oral histories at the Center for Lowell History talks about a bar called the Cosmo, which is short for the Cosmopolitan. Anyway, so I've done a lot of looking into the Cosmopolitan. And the oral histories also mention another bar called the Majestic, which is just past the library. The building still stands, actually. It's a building that has sort of the white plaster first floor and then the brick apartments on top, and it says the Majestic over it. It's just past the library, but that's where that would have been located. The building where the Cosmopolitan was standing is not around anymore. It was on Market Street, and the Cosmopolitan is a really long-standing institution in a way. I started seeing ads for it in the Lowell Sun starting in the 1930s, and then I think it was open until the early 90s. I think, I'm not entirely sure. It was around for a long time. And I had to do some real digging into this because there were some interesting advertisements that had interesting language I wasn't expecting. So like they talk about, there's one ad that calls it "Where Good Fellows Meet," sort of in the 40s, 50s era. When earlier in its establishment, there's also ads that talk about, you know, booths for ladies and men, but separate lunch counter for men. So I was like, that's a lot to have in one place, but, you know, that's really interesting too. And I did some digging around it. So the Cosmopolitan was on Market Street, kind of in the Greek Triangle area, you know, so, and it was opened in the 30s, so not, you know, kind of within that Greek Triangle era too. And it got me thinking, you know, we talk about like the Greek coffee houses being all men. So that probably explains some of, you know, this gendered language early on in its advertisements, how there's ladies, but also separate areas for men. But that also makes me wonder, like, is that what made it kind of a LGBTQ hangout? You know, if people later on are describing it as a place where gay men would hang out, like, is it because of that early reputation of it just having these lunch counters separate for men in a way? You know, there's some head scratching there that I'm thinking about. There's also some really interesting, the first owner was someone named Jimmy Vakulis. I don't know if I'm saying the name right, but there's this really interesting profile of him in the Lowell Sun that's like kind of an ode to masculinity in a way. It's the only way I could think of it. It's like, it reads like some sort of singles ad in a way, like Jimmy once hunted a bear and like did all this stuff, and like, and there's just not much context given around this being in the newspaper beyond he's the owner of the Cosmopolitan. So, and to my knowledge, Jimmy never married. So I wonder if this is like some sort of compensation or like some sort of like trying to, you know, kind of the Shakespearean metaphor, the lady doth protest too much. Like, I wonder if it's something like that. I really don't know. There's, you know, there's a lot of mysteries about this Jimmy. And then there's the second owner was another James too. So, you know, and I need to look more into his life as well. But there's a lot of question marks about the Cosmopolitan. It was sort of remembered later on that this was sort of like the tough bar, like biker gang bar, I guess. And there's a lot of kind of interesting reports in the Lowell Sun of like different crimes happening around there, you know, muggings and things like that, you know, with tough biker people, I guess. But it's also, this is the one reference I saw to people of color kind of having a hangout spot that was, you know, in the same place as the gay community. You know, the other bars that I've read about or seen in different oral histories didn't mention very much people of color. There's actually some reference that, you know, maybe some Black soldiers from Fort Danvers might come and try to hang out at Moody Gardens sometimes, but, you know, there's not that much reference. So that's why I was really like trying to dive into the Cosmopolitan and kind of see what about these intersecting communities and cultures hanging out. I remember once I was going to London and a friend of mine told me about a lesbian bar that was there. And I was like, oh, I'd like to go check it out. And he was like, no, it's a really tough crowd. No, you wouldn't know. So like there's some interesting notes of like class and race and sexuality, like all sorts of things just bound up in these bars. And that was sort of,
I mean,
yeah.
and that whole, I mean, what I know about the area you're describing, it was put by the military, the area was put off limits
Yeah.
during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never seen the association you were just talking about, but the area was definitely thought of as what people would have thought of back then as the red light district, right? Where there would have been prostitution, where soldiers would have gone and been beaten up and robbed, or, you know, something worse happening. And soldiers were really told, you know, you can't go to Lowell.
So, you know, as we get into later eras, anytime I see the Cosmopolitan brought up in the Lowell Sun, it's because of there's some crime report there, usually. You know, I think one of them was like, man gets chased shirtless down Market Street or something like that. There was like some really interesting ones.
I feel like you might still see that today.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there were police raids for sure. And some of the oral histories that I've read, not so much about the Cosmopolitan, but I think one of the other gay bars talked about how, like, if the police were coming or at the door, the owner would turn on this light switch that would put on a red light in the bar. So like if there were two men dancing together and two women dancing together, they'd know to switch partners. So they looked heterosexual for the police. You know, and I think that's also a common thing you see in other areas too, just given what I've read about ones in New York and other places across the country. So definitely Vice Squad were the people coming into raid. Lynn Berry talks about it in her oral histories too, of the police coming in and arresting everybody, and they usually keep them overnight in jail and then just let them go.
It's just the harassment.
It's the harassment. And I think, you know, there's definitely like, Lynn Berry doesn't mention this in her oral histories, but other oral histories around the same phenomenon talk about the police being really violent and, you know, kind of really assaulting the people that they are arresting and taking in. Leslie Feinberg in Stone Butch Blues talks about that a lot. So it's definitely a common phenomenon. Definitely happened at the Cosmopolitan. Not so much, so sometimes with the Cosmopolitan, you know, there's these weird reports that come up of like people running down the street, you know, and patrons, right? But there's also reports of the police coming in and kind of going after the owners too. Usually the charge was gambling, that I find with the Cosmopolitan and with the Majestic as well. There's some charges of gambling going on. And whether it was actually gambling or not, you know, who knows? It could just be they're calling it something else in the paper. And I know Allison actually has looked up when she was doing research about Prohibition, that the police would really go after particularly Greek establishments and target Greek establishments for violating Prohibition. Cosmopolitan was owned, you know, in different incarnations by Greek community members. Majestic, I can't quite remember. I think actually I think the Majestic was owned by a woman for a while, so I couldn't quite pin down a connection to the Greek community, but as long-term as the Cosmopolitan, but I think, you know, there is some connection at different points that the police targeted and looked at gambling, or it was reported they looked at gambling, right? So that was
Wow.
yeah, for sure. That's definitely a thing that happens, absolutely.
You know, I think Bob said it very well in the last episode. You know, we talk a lot about I think we do heavily focus on marginalized groups in Lowell, and Bob said, you know, there's always the fight for space, for safety, and living your life the way you want to live. And I think these stories are just confirming that, and sadly also confirms Lowell's history with prejudice against different identity groups. But we always find our community, right? And we find our people. And I think that's one thing that I think we can say is uplifting from all of these things that we've heard is that people will find their people. And like, I think it was Lynn Berry who said, I'm going to look out for my people. Right. And I think that's my takeaway. That's where we have to look out for our people, you know?
Yeah. And I think something that's really interesting and something that was very unexpected for me when doing this research. So, you know, Boston does have quite a few more resources in doing this research and looking into this history. And one of those places is called the History Project. It's an LGBTQ archive. And something that's really amazing that they have from the 80s and 90s is a collection called the Robert Quinn Memorial Books. And these are 26 scrapbooks. In those scrapbooks are 7,000 obituaries of people who died from AIDS, people who died from hate crimes. It's an immense, immense resource. And it's searchable, which is lovely of the History Project to make it searchable and online. And there's definitely a few references to Lowell, people in Lowell who have passed from AIDS for sure. But something that is unexpected is that there's an obituary of Paul Tsongas in there as well. So we talk about Paul Tsongas a lot at the park. You know, he's the senator who pushed for the establishment of the park, but he's in this scrapbook. You know, he didn't die from AIDS, he died from cancer, but he's remembered for being the first senator to try to campaign for an LGBTQ civil rights bill in Congress. So, which I find really interesting and really fascinating. And again, another connection to the Greek community too. And I tried to pinpoint, you know, why Tsongas would be so into pushing for the civil rights bill. He actually has connections to the Transfiguration Church, as did the two other Jims from the Cosmopolitan. You know, he was also around kind of the same era as David Skondras, who is from Lowell, but became the first openly gay Boston City Councilor. And David Skondras also founded Fenway Health, which is one of the top places for LGBTQ healthcare in the country. So there's a lot of I think you can make a case that he would have rubbed elbows with these people and, you know, have learned from seeing and living in Lowell around kind of this area, you know, instances of LGBTQ life. And I'd have to do more research and digging for sure, but I wonder if that's sort of what made him kind of into advocating for LGBTQ people. So, you know, there's definitely a history of prejudice and, you know, not so great things. But then there's, you know, this wonder of finding Paul Tsongas in a collection of scrapbooks that are meant for gay men, but then Paul Tsongas is seen as such an ally. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually really, that I did not know that.
There's a story of him at a campaign rally, I think, in maybe when he was starting his presidential run. But he was in New Hampshire and there was an activist there from ACT UP, which I am familiar with because I love the musical Rent. But there's, you know, if you're not familiar, it is the AIDS Coalition to, I'm forgetting what UP stands for, but it is one of those organizations in the 80s and 90s that was really fighting for increased funding for AIDS research and trying to better the conditions for people living with AIDS. There was an active activist at this rally, and he actually gave Paul Tsongas the shirt off his back because he was like, you have been such an ally to people struggling with AIDS, to the gay community, like literally giving the shirt off his back to him at this rally. So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you guys are amazing. Thank you so much, Resi, for this very, as Bob said, it's so complex, and Lowell continues to be complex in these ways, but we know that community exists and we're still going to keep fighting. Unfortunately, yes, in 2020, we are still fighting for the rights and safety of people to just exist as themselves, but we will do that. And with people like us, how could we not be successful? Come on. So thank you, Resi. Thank you, Bob. And thank you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell.